Welcome everyone to the 10th webinar in Contact's Produce Safety webinar series. This second season will tackle a new fresh produce food safety topic every month through a dynamic webinar series that will continue to bring together industry, academia, and regulatory minds to solve some of the produce industry's biggest and most timely challenges. This series is part of a project called Contact, or scientific challenges and cost-effective management of risks associated with implementation of produce safety regulations. This project is supported by the Specialty Crops Research Initiative from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the view of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This webinar series, coupled with other research and extension efforts, are part of a collaborative effort across 10 different universities and government institutions to enhance produce safety, knowledge, and compliance across the industry. We are so grateful to our collaborators for their efforts and support of this webinar series. You can see their logos on the screen. This webinar series will continue next month with a talk by Dr. Don Schaffner about how you can use tools to assess and rank risks in production water use on Thursday, December 8th, 2022. He's got a cute title, Risky to You, Part 2, and we hope you'll join us. This year's webinar series will address brand new topics chosen by you. We've got an exciting new list of webinars scheduled for this year, covering topics like sanitation, foodborne outbreak attribution, and much more. If you think of a topic or you think one is missing from this list, please let us know in the comments, the Q&A, webinar surveys, or on our social media pages. We're always happy to make contact with you. And of course, our webinar series, again, lets us meet with you once a month, but it's never enough for us. We'd love to hashtag make contact with you about today's webinar or other produce safety news and research on our Twitter and Instagram pages. You can follow us on these platforms at ps_sci or check out our YouTube page. You can Google Produce Safety Science. A quick reminder for today, if you would like to submit a question for our speaker during or before the Q&A session, please submit your questions through the Q&A box, not the chat box, and you can submit them at any time. Now let's welcome our speaker today, Dr. Channah Rock. Dr. Rock is a professor at the University of Arizona in the Department of Environmental Science and also maintains a joint appointment as a water quality specialist with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. Dr. Rock is a PI on several projects relating to microbial evaluation of water quality for the protection of public health. Dr. Rock currently supports the California and Arizona LGMA by providing science-based recommendations for ag water treatment under the new irrigation water metrics, as well as supports the Arizona Department of Agriculture as a trainer for the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule grower trainings. She holds a BS degree in microbiology from New Mexico State University and an MS and PhD in environmental engineering from Arizona State University. Welcome, and the floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I appreciate the opportunity. We came up with a catchy title, and a lot of folks have been discussing and chatting about the proposed subpart E, so we thought that this would be a great next topic to cover under the Contact webinar series. I'm going to walk through a series of slides talking about hazards and risks and some strategies that we are thinking about when we're going out to work with industry related to what might happen under the proposed subpart E language. And then we're going to give you all the opportunity to play too. We're going to evaluate some of your feedback on risk ranking, and we'll see how that goes here in a bit. As Laura said, my name is Dr. Channah Rock. I'm a water quality specialist here at the University of Arizona. I spend a ton of time down in the Southwest growing region and support a lot of folks that are subject to obviously the produce safety rule, but also the Arizona and the California LGMAs. So thought it would be a good place to start, specifically related to a lot of the initial interpretation of Subpart E, and I'll get into that in a second. But a lot of folks that we have been talking to seem to interchange the words or the terminology hazard versus risk. And so I thought it would be a good idea to put up the definitions just to make sure that we are all on the same page. So here on the left, a hazard is a biological, chemical, or physical agent in or condition of food with the potential to cause an adverse health effect. I think the key word there is potential, and I've bolded that for you guys there. A risk, on the other hand, is the probability or the likelihood of that adverse health event occurring as an impact of that hazard. And so I think it's important to differentiate the two. Oftentimes, what we're doing when we're out in the field or doing a root cause analysis, we're trying to identify the hazards or the potential route of those hazards in and around the produce growing environment. It's not until you assign some additional factors related to risk about the dose of the organism, who that organism might be, who that might be exposed to, either through drinking water or eating that contaminated produce. Those are really some of the things that we start to think about when we think about risk. And so we just want to reiterate, there's no such thing as zero risk. And I think it's important for us to think about that context as we move through what we might have to do under Subpart E. So again, just a really easy example of identifying hazards versus risks. On the left-hand side, we have a hammer, that's our hazard. That toolbox is in the middle is controlling or managing or influencing that hazard, but the actual act of hammering is the risk. So hopefully that gentleman does a good job and it doesn't become hurt using that hammer, but that's the actual risky activity. To take it a little bit more close to home, on the left-hand side, we have E. coli bacteria. That's our hazard. Let's just say that E. coli bacteria is in our water source. So that method of irrigation that we're using on produce is controlling or managing or influencing that hazard. And then a salad, the act of eating that salad is that risky behavior. And that's the thing that presents the risk to an individual. So we have a lot of questions also that we get from industry about what is an acceptable risk and is any risk acceptable? So I grew up in the drinking water and the wastewater world for most of my degrees. And so I often reflect back on what the Environmental Protection Agency looks at acceptability for risk. Currently, the EPA considers one infection, so one case of gastrointestinal illness per 10,000 individuals in a given year as a reasonable guideline for potable drinking water. So a lot of folks are saying, where did that come from? And so basically this number was derived in 1987 by looking at the waterborne disease burden Americans already tolerated. So what people were already experiencing and were already basically okay with. So that's the total reported cases of a waterborne illness per year. And then it was estimated to be about 25,000. So they took 25,000, they divided it by the US population at that time, which was 250 million, and you come up with this acceptable risk level. Now, we know that this is drinking water, for example, and we know that tolerances or acceptability is going to shift or change over time. And so basically, this is a starting place, and it's easy for us to look at this and to point to as an acceptability risk or a guideline for protecting public health. I think we always have to be aware that we're always trying to achieve or kind of work towards bringing that acceptability down and bringing that risk tolerance down, especially in fresh produce. Another thing we have to think about in this shift with Subpart E, which I'll talk about in a second, is that historically we've used numerical standards. So we use some quantitative values, which can be helpful. They set limit by either the number of the organisms in a given volume water or that tolerable, those number of illnesses per person per year in that population. And that can be really helpful and appropriate for guiding improvements. But what do you do when you don't necessarily have a target or a threshold to aim for? And I think that's what we're talking about when we think about potentially an ag water assessment, which I'll get into in a second. So unfortunately, for standards to be meaningful and also enforceable and scientifically and legally enforced, you have to have a certain level of confidence related to them. So I think a lot of the things that we are going to be working on in cooperative extension is trying to build confidence in industry to be able to perform as outlined in the produce safety rule proposed language for subpart E, and also trying to build consensus over what is risky, potentially what is less risky, and how we make those decisions from a grower standpoint versus someone who's going to be regulating a farm. Another thing that we have talked about related to subpart E is that there's been a lot of talking about the removal of the testing requirements, or the not necessarily making testing requirements mandatory. And so I just wanted to put out, there's been a lot of talk about testing. It's an important reminder that we know that testing is not necessarily a silver bullet, and so that you can use testing of water, for example, to measure pathogens or indicators. And that can certainly help industry understand the potential risks that are there, but they're not absolute risks, and not all testing is created equal. It's important to really think about how it can be used, and more importantly, how it can't be used. I think another important thing that we saw with the revision to subpart E was that you must take into practical considerations like the cost and the sensitivity and the specificity and the ease of use and speed of analysis and all those different things that go into testing. And in the absence of having all of these pieces equally lined up, potentially a water assessment can serve that role. So regardless of all those things I said, we as extension educators still try to recommend to industry to continue to take samples just to get to know their water sources and to better understand that relationship of what we might see as far as indicators in your water sources and how that might play a role in a risk assessment. But also, again, as I said earlier, in order for that to be useful, we need to also understand that relationship between those pathogens, say that they're there, and that risk of infection. So just because you test and find a number, that's not the end of the answer. So some interesting food for thought to think about is, despite the fact that we've done lots of risk assessments on various pathogens and produce types, none have been used to establish a regulatory limit for pathogens in produce. Zero is ultimately still the goal. If zero is still the goal, is zero risk really zero? I think a lot of folks are still discussing this and working towards wrapping their head around what ag water might look like in the future, if treatment might be a component of that, and what treatment really does with respect to residual indicator organisms and respect to pathogens, and even with respect to the use of potable water. Still, if you test and you don't necessarily find an organism there, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is zero risk associated with that. So some of the questions we're still getting for industry and questions to consider is, should we still test agricultural water? I previously said yes, that's still something that is important potentially and can help build up and be part of a farm assessment. But again, it's important to understand what those limitations are, what results do mean and what they don't mean, and not creating that false sense of security, which I just mentioned. Testing can be beneficial to really identify some of those gross contamination events or track trends over time. But again, think of it as part of a farm assessment. And even if it's not mandatory under the proposed language in subpart E, it still can be a beneficial tool for a farm to use. So what's up with agriculture water? Why all this built up? So obviously, most, if not all of you who've been paying attention to environmental assessment reports published by the FDA have noticed that a number of investigations of foodborne illness and outbreaks have implicated irrigation water as a potential source for outbreak pathogens and strains. And so underneath the proposed subpart E language, there is this new inclusion of what we're calling an agriculture water assessment, or what they're calling an agriculture water assessment. I like to call it an agua. Agua in Spanish is water, or an agua. Basically, this is allowing the farm to evaluate hazards that may potentially impact agriculture water quality. There is a large focus on adjacent land use, and there is some implications for, or some language about implications for conducting a risk assessment. As related to this proposed language, there are mitigations that are associated if you find a water is risky. And those two mitigations include the first, die off, so that same provision that we saw previously, And then the second one is treatment. There's some specific language tied to treatment that we work with industry on, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Current rule on the left-hand side, FDA is defining what adequate sanitary quality looks like. That was really based on building that microbial water quality profile, if you all remember that, looking at the geometric mean and the statistical threshold value for generic E. coli. We have those values there in the gray box on the left. And then for harvest and post-harvest applications, that non-detectable generic E. coli, so less than 1 CFU. The proposed language on the right-hand side shifts gears a bit, as I said earlier, where the farm now makes a determination of what adequate sanitary quality is. And that's largely based on an agriculture water assessment. Now, there are some exemptions. So obviously, if you're using groundwater with no detectable generic E. coli, and there's testing that is still required for that. If you're receiving water from a public water supply and you're able to receive documentation for that. And then the third is if you're treating your agriculture water in accordance with the produce safety rule language. And so that hasn't necessarily shifted or changed. And so we're happy to see those exemptions that are still available and options that are still available to industry. So I'll get to an agriculture water assessment here in a second, but if there's no known or reasonable foreseeable hazards for which you might have to do a mitigation, then the goal is to inspect and maintain your system regularly and at least once a year. You'll see I've pulled these slides as supplemental material from the Produce Safety Alliance, so thank you for that. If you determine through your agriculture water assessment that the water is not safe and of adequate sanitary quality, the goal is then to immediately discontinue use and then take corrective measures before use and at pre-harvest. And so again, you're using that agriculture water assessment to guide some of the decisions that must be made about how that water is used. Now, if you do identify a reasonably foreseeable hazard and it is related to animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin, or human waste for which a mitigation might be necessary, resulting mitigation is going to be promptly, right? So implement those measures promptly, but no later than the same growing season. So it seems as though FDA is giving you some time to be able to make a correction or make a mitigation based on that reasonable foreseeable hazard. And then below that, if one or known reasonable foreseeable hazards is not related to animal activity or human waste or biological soil amendments of animal origin, you're going to implement that mitigation measure as soon as practical, but no later than the following year. So again, you're given some additional time to be able to make those mitigations occur. Or you could test water as part of your agriculture water assessment. So again, adding some flexibility there for growers to be able to apply those mitigations in a timely manner, but understanding and recognizing that not all mitigations can be done immediately. So I think another important thing to think about as we're wrapping our heads around how do we train folks in industry to be able to comply with the proposed language? How do we get regulators up to speed on how they're going to do inspections related to the proposed language? FDA has recognized that's going to take some time. And so for pre-harvest production, ag water requirements for covered produce other than sprouts, we have the business sizes on the left-hand side and then the proposed compliance dates. And so this would be after the language is finalized. So all the large businesses, all our businesses over 500,000, 9 months after the effective date. So that date and that final language has been approved and released. For small businesses, it's 1 year and 9 months. And for very small, it's 2 years and 9 months. So again, some additional time that, if finalized, would allow industry to be able to respond. And so that was good to be able to see the FDA is listening to folks about the challenges that they may face related to that. So let's get on and start talking about what is an agriculture water assessment and what is the tool and what that might look like. FDA did come out with an agriculture water assessment builder. It's an online tool, and we can provide either the link in the chat or we can send that out to you guys later if you've not been online to be able to see that. They also have a paper version, which is really nice, and that allows you to be able to print it off and to go through the series of questions. It's really nice because it's anonymous and it is a series of questions, and those questions all are highlighted, or those areas of questions are all highlighted below. So you see animal impacts and activities, crop characteristics, ag water use practices, environmental conditions, human waste, biological soil amendments. And so it's a really nice, pretty comprehensive set of questions that walks a grower through all of these different practices that they do on their farm with relation to water and how they grow their produce, and asks them to answer specific yes and no questions about if these might be risky activities. Ultimately, at the end of this assessment builder, and Dawn will be talking a bit more about this in the next webinar series, those decisions are driven by the user and they're not necessarily linked to the data inputs. And there's not survey logic that's built into this. There's no risk ranking that's built into it. It's generally a series of yes or no or just documentation questions. And so that brings up some additional questions related to its usefulness and what are some additional things that growers are going to need to really understand the potential hazards and risks on their farm with respect to water usage. So it could potentially make things easier. As we said, it offers flexibility, and some growers are already have many of these pieces in place. And so that's been really nice. And what we've heard from FDA is that in general, most of the comments have been very supportive as they're starting to go through that language. However, in some cases, and some of us think that the proposed rule could potentially make things more difficult. And we've listed some of the concerns here. And so it's unclear how someone would systematically move through this on their farm. It does expect a lot from growers, and a lot of growers don't have the training to think like a bacteria or think like a pathogen in the environment. And there's very few people that have the training to be able to do that. And then the last thing is, how will it be regulated? A lot of the content in an agriculture water assessment is very subjective. And the activity that we're going to walk through you guys today will show you some of that subjectivity, and it'll be interesting to see how everybody ranks out. What could an agriculture water assessment include? Here's some kind of initial thoughts on things that we've been talking to industry about. So thinking about potentially a map or an orientation of your fields, obviously your water sources and turnouts, ownerships of lateral mains, maybe potential weather stations. And so maybe some of this stuff growers are already having to have as part of the produce safety rule. So that would be nice to see that continuation. Some other things that they might be interested in are maintenance activities, if there's seasonal activities that go on, potential timeline and scheduling of irrigation events that might occur in and around your region. And then the last one on the right-hand side, some ideas related to animals and compost and adjacent land. So is there compost staging areas in and around your water sources? So no longer thinking of just those animal operations adjacent to your actual farming production practices, but what's going on adjacent to the conveyance of your water source from where your turnout is or where your pump is or where your field is, however many miles upstream of that, and what is that mileage and does that matter? Also, those locations of animal operations, and then thinking about how potentially those activities on adjacent land shift or change throughout the growing season. And so those are some of our initial thoughts. The next couple of slides I have are really thinking about those categories and what are some things that we've started to train folks against. So animal impact and activities, and although these three pictures are really rare events that can happen, they can happen. And certainly these aren't the only animal activities that you have to be worried about, but I like to use these as examples. So animal movement patterns during the year shift and change. Also, we know that climate and seasonal impacts on water availability might motivate those animals to seek alternative water sources. And so do you have documentation about that? What does that look like throughout the year? How are you going to record that? And how are you going to prove to FDA that you've been able to mitigate that? The next one that we've been talking a lot about is crop characteristics. And I think this is probably the most controversial of the parts of the assessment that we have seen or talked about to date. So just thinking about the crops that I have shown here, we've got romaine lettuce on the left, cantaloupes in the middle, some peppers, and then apples on a tree. So not all surfaces are created equal. We have smooth versus rough textures related to, do those surfaces allow for pathogens either to be retained or to hide? A lot of times, a lot of folks talk about romaine and they talk about it being a cup or a bowl shape, being able to hold on to either water or dust or particulate at an increased frequency. There's also the likelihood of that you need to pay attention to about the likelihood for ag water touching that harvestable portion of the crop. And we've seen that language repeated over and over with FDA. Is that crop grown on the ground or is it up in a tree? And does that potentially change that risk profile? I think anecdotally, we can say yes, probably all of these things play a role. But what do we do when we don't have scientific data to confirm some of those initial theories that we might have? And how do we deal with that in a regulatory framework? It's extremely subjective, and this will largely be challenging, I think, for industry to be able to tackle. The other area is ag water use practices. So consider how your ag water is delivered either onto your ranch or your farm. Things we've thought about before: where's your water source? Is it surface? Is it ground? Is it a public water system? But beyond that, how is it being delivered onto your farm? How is it being distributed onto your farm? Can the way that you move and distribute water and apply water to a crop impact the potential risk profile? And so again, we think about risks related to overhead application versus furrow versus drip. And there's different risk profiles for those. And luckily, we do have some scientific data that we can lean on for some of these, but certainly not all of these different practices related to water. Another one that's a little bit controversial too, but I think that we have a fairly good handle on, is environmental conditions. So we know that bacteria like to survive and thrive in very specific sets of environmental conditions related to temperature and humidity, and potentially the availability of their food sources. So that could potentially be one aspect of environmental conditions. But I think things that are pretty straightforward is about rainfall, either quantity or intensity, and the potential for rain to pull and to flow overland and to pick up contaminants and to pull them into our surface water sources. I think that one's pretty straightforward, and we have scientific data to be able to do that. But we do also have questions about UV and solar radiation. Does that look the same in the desert Southwest as it looks in Salinas, or if it looks in Florida or looks in New York? And does that potentially impact the ability for microorganisms to die off over time or to extend their profiles and to be able to survive extended periods of time that make it risky? So again, we're asking industry to make decisions about these environmental conditions, but we don't necessarily have comprehensive scientific data that backs up all of these different characteristics. Another one, and a big one that we've been talking a lot about, is adjacent land use or biological soil amendments. And so basically what we're asking industry is, ask what your neighbors are up to. Maybe you can control your own crop products really well, but what products are being applied in the off season or on surrounding lands? And can you start to build up content and information about that? Start talking to your neighbors. So here on the left-hand side is compost staging near a canal. So a great mitigation for this is to the compost supplier and ask them to not stage the compost there, to move to a yard that's far away from your water source. And that's an easy mitigation. The one on the right-hand side is poultry litter application, which might be fine unless you're growing a leafy green right next door. And so potentially the conversation is about, can we apply poultry litter on non-windy days so you don't get that potential transfer? Or can you move your crop rotations around? So some of these mitigations are not always easy and not always under your control, but the best place to start is having these conversations with your neighbors. So water treatment, near and dear to my heart and a number of other folks as well, has always been an option under the produce safety rule, either as a routine operating procedure or now we're deeming a mitigation measure. So under the proposed rule, this is still the case, but instead of the growers using those original quantification of geometric mean and STV with generic E. coli to drive if they needed to treat their water, they're now looking at the outcome of your agriculture water assessment to drive that decision. I think that while that can be fine and can be good, it is still important to understand the quality of the water you're starting with before treatment, so that you understand if your treatment is effective or not. And so those folks that are still leaning on water treatment, we really suggest and still push to have some level of water quality analysis in the pre-treatment space so that they can do that well. But we don't want it to seem like water treatment is the only mitigation measure, the only solution that growers can face if they do deem their water having a reasonable, likely foreseeable hazard. And so here's some things other than treatment that might be applicable under the proposed subpart E language. So thinking about irrigation timing, also probably the method of your irrigation. Maybe you're switching from an overhead to a furrow or a drip application. We did see some shifts in the desert Southwest in past years related to the method of irrigation. Also, proper cleaning and maintenance of your ag water system should always be done, but potentially that could help reduce those potential risks. Thinking about pre-filtration as well, and then trying to remove the potential and known hazards that are in and around your production area, if you can and if they're in your control, but that's not always the case. Another thing that we've been starting to do is talk about mitigations on the rancher side. And so all of a sudden now we're having to have produce folks and animal folks have more intimate type conversations about the potential for risk transfer. And so we put together some lower, no cost or medium investment mitigation measures that potentially could reduce the potential risk from animals on adjacent land. And most of these are related to compost best practices, which most folks are already doing, animal pen best practices, thinking about dust abatement, or reducing or changing when they're working on composted material or shifting those windy days. And so those are some of the initial conversations that we've been having with some animal producers on adjacent land. Medium investment are shifts in where these things are occurring related to produce. So do produce growers and ranchers get together and have some determinations about when they're doing what over the time of year, and can they come to consensus about some ways to help reduce or potentially mitigate the potential hazards that might be available? So as I keep saying over and over, growers don't necessarily have control over those adjacent lands to either identify or control those risks. And so you can only see what you can see. And some of these things are extremely hard, incredibly hard to identify. So what about the impact of failing septic systems underground? What about groundwater that's under the influence of surface water? You have a transit nature of portable toilets moving in and around production areas. And then what about upstream impacts? So what if you have an illegal discharge upstream? What if you have a rain event that occurs 10 miles away and you don't start to see that impact on your water source until 4 or 5 days later? So there's lots of different things that potentially could occur that you would never know about because they're very hard to see. They're not all point sources. I think another thing that folks have brought up about there's different federal and state agencies have jurisdiction over different areas covered by the rule. So again, you might be able to make some certain suggestions, but depending upon the federal and state regulations, you might not be able to impose change or shifts, especially when we're talking about adjacent land use or somebody else's property. And then additionally, some valuable information that could obviously benefit growers might be held by federal agencies and not collected in a way that makes it accessible. And so some of the things we're thinking about: National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, information that's collected by the EPA on a basis related to surface waters as well as groundwater quality. So there might be lots of ways that we can start to make lists of information that is important and then slowly work about generating and collecting that information so that it can be useful by industry. So there are exemptions, thank goodness. So farms are exempt from conducting a pre-harvest agriculture water assessment if the farm documents that the water meets certain harvest and post-harvest water criteria, is received from a public water supply or meets that requirement. Again, documentation is needed, or is treated in accordance with standards outlined in FSMA produce safety rule. So again, that treatment component is important, and we like to lean on that a lot. And we're working on trying to be able to have chemistries available to industry, but still, currently, there are no labeled chemistries for pre-harvest agriculture water treatment that have pathogens on the label. If this rule was passed tomorrow, industry would not be able to treat their water in accordance to FSMA PSR, but we're working on it and we're trying to build up data that can then be used by EPA and FDA. So we're hopeful to be able to move that needle forward. It's not all doom and gloom, but what is industry to do? So the first thing that we're starting to tell folks is to get their boots on the ground, get your team together. It's important that we keep saying that it's going to be more than one person that's going to be conducting an agriculture water assessment. If I do an agriculture water assessment and Laura does an agriculture water assessment, they're going to look different, and we're going to identify potentially different hazards and have potentially different recommendations. So they're going to be different for every individual, every operation, and will likely vary seasonal or even time of day. The time of day story that I like to tell is that we have a water source that has bridges that are over that water source. We go out in the morning, there's no birds under the bridge, it's nice and clear. We don't see any reasonably likely foreseeable risks there. Yet when we go back at the end of the day, when it's really starting to warm up and hot, we have birds that are populating underneath that bridge and potentially defecating into that water. So reasonably likely foreseeable hazard, yes. So that's going to vary, again, seasonally or even time of day. So it's also important that we're starting to talk about reassessing multiple times and potentially with multiple people to try to capture some of that variability. And always in the back of your mind, thinking about that you're going to have to be able to justify any of your actions or any of your findings back to FDA and to be confident in being able to do that. So an activity that we like to do is risk ranking, and that can help identify where to invest your time and resources and money. It's a nice tool that you can use in the absence of having scientific data. And we're going to walk through that here in a second. And then lastly, communication is key. So starting to talk to your neighbors sooner than later. Obviously, not everybody is in produce production. And so they're completely unaware of some of the activities that they may or may not be doing that could potentially impact your water sources. So before we get into the risk ranking, does this look risky to you? We put this slide together, myself and a few folks, thinking about trying to visualize what that acceptable risk threshold might be. So ultimately, we'd like to have an equal level of public health protection, but there's lots of different ways that industry can get there. And so we have this idea of stacking these boxes up one by one to reach that finish line or over that risk threshold, and recognizing that from a regulatory standpoint, that no one farm is going to look the same and that everybody's mitigations are potentially going to look different. And these are just some potential ones that we might start to look at. All right. So the next part is the fun part, and we'll see if we can do this. We've done this now with 4 different groups, and it's a really nice activity that gets you to wrap your head around what is risky to somebody might not be as risky to somebody else. And how would you teach this? And how would you justify your actions based upon that? So we're calling it the Risk Assessment Roundup. The reason being is that we just purchased a horse for my 8-year-old daughter. And so I thought it was clever and appropriate. So here we go. So risk ranking can help identify where, again, to invest your time and money and resources. And really, it potentially can be something that we can teach industry to use, or we can use in cooperative extension when we have an absence of scientific data. So if we don't have die-off data, and we don't have pathogen data, and we don't have indicator data, how are we supposed to make these decisions about the reasonably likely foreseeable hazards in our water sources? And so some of the things that you can do is think about assumptions, which a lot of folks are in that boat right now. We can learn from past experiences. So if you had this water source that always had a problem year after year, likely you're going to have continued problems as you move forward. So that's your past experience. Potentially, you can pull data from other similar locations or scenarios. And so if you have neighbors that have similar growing practices from you, you can pull some of their data. We can also use decision trees, and I'm going to put a decision tree up next. But I think the idea related to risk ranking is that if we are overprotective of public health, potentially we're spending additional money or resources. If we're underprotective and we don't necessarily invest in those things that are the best bang for your buck with respect to risk reduction, potentially you could have increased illnesses. And so where's that balance? I think in public health and public health protection, we always want to err on the side of overprotection, but we also have to recognize that industry doesn't have unlimited resources to be able to throw at potentially some of these hazards. And so if you only have a limited number of dollars and resources, where's the best place for you to invest those to help reduce your risk? So here's an example. This is the IFPA risk assessment scheme for assessing risk of pre-harvest agriculture water. The link is there on the screen, and we can add that into the chat as well or send this to you afterwards. But again, it's looking at your pre-harvest agriculture water, thinking about the different sources and delivery systems and application methods, and applying low risk, medium risk, or high risk results to help guide some decision making. And so this is a very basic risk ranking profile, and it's a nice kind of entry level way into thinking about your production system and associated risk. Now, what we also like to do, and some concepts that we're starting to talk to folks now, is thinking about creating a risk score or risk assessment result. And this can be a management tool to differentiate between different risks that may need to be controlled. And so thinking about risk as a result of the severity as well as the likelihood or the probability of an event occurring. So the likelihood is how likely that something will occur that potentially could cause harm. And the severity is the seriousness of the potential illness or human outcome or the potential health consequences. And so here's an example risk assessment matrix. There's a couple of them I'm going to show you today. We have severity on the bottom. We have likelihood on the left-hand side. And as if you move from left to right, you have potentially increasing risk. Now, here's another way to look at that. So likelihood on the left, potential consequences on the right-hand side. And then you can see the varying risk levels from low to very high for these different potential assessments. So I'm going to have you guys all work through a risk matrix here in a second, but I thought it would be good to show you one just as an example, a pretty easy one to wrap your head around it. So what is the potential risk here? We have an animal, poor little elk. He's in the surface water conveyance, which is a canal. That water is being used for overhead irrigation of produce. You see that picture in the center of the slide. So think to yourself, what is that likelihood? So maybe we'll say it's unlikely, but it's possible. And we might vary on our likelihood scale. But in the event that it did happen, how severe would the consequences be? And so we might put that at moderate or major. So then if we look again at the risk assessment matrix, we might be here in the medium to high risk category if we're thinking about the likelihood and those potential consequences. So I'm going to go through right now a series of pictures, and we're going to show these to you again. And then we're going to ask you about how you would rank these risks based on the things that you're seeing here. Upper left is furrow irrigation of some leafy greens. On the upper right, there's some frost protection of strawberries. On the bottom left, there's overhead irrigation of some produce. I'm not sure exactly what it is. And then on the bottom, we have drip irrigation of peppers. So these are thinking about our ag water use practices. Here's our adjacent land use, our animals. Upper left, there's those birds, those pesky birds that showed up in the afternoon that were not there in the morning. Upper right is that poultry litter next door. Bottom left, you have some sheep and a donkey and orange orchard that's on adjacent lands to your water source. And on the bottom right is that compost that is adjacent to that canal. Here we have crop characteristics. So strawberries, we have greenhouse grown, not sure, I think it's peppers. Bottom left, you have romaine, and bottom you have wide bed spinach that is growing. For your ag water sources, upper left is a canal. Upper right is a surface water reservoir, so groundwater pumped into a reservoir, On the bottom left is an earthen lined, it might be a river or it might be an earthen lined canal system. And then on the bottom right is a well, a groundwater wellhead. And then here's the last one, freeze events occurring on the upper left, a rain event occurring on the upper right, a windy event, a dusty windy event on the bottom, and then sunshine on the bottom right. So everybody get your phones out or open up another screen. And we're going to go to menti.com and we're going to use the code 81347565, or you can get your camera out and take a picture. So let's get that going. So what is the risk to produce becoming contaminated because of the following irrigation methods when using likely contaminated surface water? All right, so we have furrow irrigation of lettuce, we have overhead irrigation of lettuce, we have frost protection of strawberries, and we have drip irrigation of peppers. So we have 44, 47 people participating. We'll wait till we get those numbers up a little bit higher. So thinking about the severity and as well as the likelihood, and it's a little bit challenging, right? Because you probably need some additional information. But say you have contaminated water, surface water, and then you're irrigating with these following methods. So as you go from left to right, you have increasing risk. Okay, we're at 85, 84, 86. I'll give some people some time to catch up. You're doing pretty good. Most, if not all of you, have drip of irrigation on the left. You have furrow, then you have frost protection, and then you have overhead. So that's actually really good. The number's still going up, so I want people to still be able to respond. Laura, how many people do we have online right now Almost 300.
Correct. So you got about half of them.
Come on, guys, participate.
That's such the extension educator.
I know, right? I can't help it. I think this is so fun. You know that drip is probably on the lower end and furrow and overhead, and then moving to the upper right. All right, let's move on to the next one. What is the risk to furrow irrigated produce due to adjacent land use animals, potentially contaminating a surface water source? So we have furrow irrigation, furrow irrigated produce, adjacent land use animals, potentially contaminating a surface water source. All right, here we go. This might be a little bit more challenging. The donkey and the sheep are the lowest risk so far. Birds over canal, poultry pellet application next door, compost staging near canal. Nice. All right, here's the next one. What's the risk of produce harboring pathogens after being irrigated with contaminated groundwater by the following method? So we have strawberries on plastic drip, romaine lettuce, greenhouse tomatoes on drip, and wide bed spinach overhead. Here we go. Let's see how these shift and change. So we have both drip guys, strawberries on plastic and greenhouses on drip on the lower left, lower risk. I think that's a pretty good assessment. And then furrow romaine, and then wide bed spinach overhead. Very good. Let's see if we can get a couple more folks. Great. I think we'll go ahead and end there. Good. So that's nice. So both of the drip options are on the lower left, indicating potentially lower risk, furrow in the middle, and then overhead on the upper right. Great. Let's get the next one. What is the risk of these ag water sources becoming contaminated with pathogens due to improperly managed animal feces on adjacent land less than 1 mile away? So I've given you an additional piece of information. Let's see if that plays a role in your assessment of these potential risks. So thinking about your different ag water source, open canal, a river, a groundwater pond, or water, and what might happen if they become contaminated, or what is the risk to them becoming contaminated with improperly managed animal feces. And this is fun. They're moving around. We're not all in agreement. Nice. So as expected, you start to see that open canal or that river moving up into the upper right-hand quadrant, potentially the higher risks associated there, followed by that groundwater pond and then water. Now, there might be some additional information you need to know about its conveyance and storage, but I think we're pretty much in agreement. All right, let's see the next one. All right, so we've shifted this a little bit and wanting to just see how you guys think about the idea of risk ranking, just low, medium, and high. So what is the risk of ice freeze damage due to contamination of fresh produce? So thinking about if you have ice, or freeze damage, potentially what that could do to help harbor organisms on fresh produce. I'm super surprised a lot of you are saying medium. We'll try to get up to 150 again. So close. All right, 150. So do we have consensus? No. So again, that might be an indication of where some additional clarity or information is needed. Let's go to the next one. So what is the risk of extreme wind to contamination of surface water? So thinking about a windy event and what might happen to your surface water. Just wind in itself, I'll just note, is not risky, but it's risky if that wind is picking up something else, those hazards in the environment or in a specific area, and blowing them into your surface water. Again, super surprising. I don't know if any of you are surprised. Maybe we'll talk about it here in a second. So 110 of you said high, 31 of you said medium, and 9 of you said low. Now, what I would love to see is who in these different groups, who are regulators, who are academics, who are industry professionals, who are food safety managers, who are students. Again, showing that there's non-consensus about the potential of these risks and hazards that might play a role. All right, I think I've got 1 or 2 more. Okay, risk of rainfall or runoff to contamination of a surface water. Hopefully you guys are enjoying these interactive tools. All right, almost to 150. So again, rainfall runoff, I think this one makes a little bit more sense or a little bit more intuitive, plus what we know about data in the literature, the potential for rainfall or runoff, and to create non-point source pollution in our surface water sources, to pull on that overland flow or pulling potential contaminants into your waters. Okay, so 103 high, 37 medium, and 10 low. All right, sunlight, our favorite one. How does sunlight or UV impact the survival of pathogens in water and on produce? So I have increases survival, decreases survival, or is not sure. So decreases survival is winning. That's nice. Competition. Again, let's see if we can get up to 150. So close. Keep voting. Close enough. So 125 of you said decreases survival. 13 of you said potentially increases survival, and 8 are not sure. Our buddy who's going to be talking at the next, John Schaffner, going to talking on the next webinar, would probably say it's complicated and it depends. And so probably that's an answer for a lot of these questions that we're posing for you today. All right, last question. If the rule was passed tomorrow with no changes, if the proposed language was passed with no changes, how easy or how difficult would it be for stakeholders you work with to be able to comply? Challenging, very challenging, business as usual. I want to know who said very easy and easy. I could guess. Cool. All right. So I think at least from the results that we see thus far, and potentially some of the questions that you answered thus far, you can see that maybe there wasn't a straightforward consensus in some of the risk-related questions that we are being asked and industry is being asked. Certainly that additional training and resources are needed to bring industry into compliance and to calibrate industry alongside the regulatory community. And the majority of you that participated today think that this would be challenging or very challenging and able to comply. Success, we got it all to work. I appreciate everybody entertaining the idea of doing an activity like that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dr. Rock. Absolutely wonderful. We've got a lot of really great comments back on the activity. And if we can dive into that a little more, we'll make sure we put that in our key takeaway documents. For all of those of you still listening, the recording portion of this will be on our YouTube page, Produce Safety Science. That will usually get back out there in about 1 week. We'll also have our key takeaway documents where we'll feature all of the resources and recap high-level findings. Thank you so much, Dr. Rock. We really appreciate it. And for all of those, have a wonderful American Thanksgiving that's coming up in a couple weeks.